So India won't give in to Trump's pressure. It is ready to face short-term pain to secure long-term national interest. And China is taking the same position, it seems. Beijing's trade talks with Washington have stalled. The deadlock is over energy. The US wants China to stop buying oil from Iran and Russia, but Beijing has refused to comply.
What if one of the world's biggest energy consumers suddenly stopped relying on oil like before? China, a country once thirsty for crude, is quietly rewriting the rules of energy security. From secretive oil imports to massive electric vehicle booms and strategic stockpiles, their approach is reshaping global power and challenging decades of oil dominance. How did they pull off this shift? And what does it mean for the future of energy and geopolitics?
Chinese are tough negotiators. We're tough too. It was led by the vice premier, my counterpart, Feng, who I have great respect for. He is both a statesman, a tough negotiator, and very senior in the leadership. We pushed back on them quite a bit and made our positions known. I believe that we have the makings of a deal.
When you look at China today, it's clear that something remarkable has happened over the last few decades. A country that was once largely rural has transformed into one of the world's biggest industrial powerhouses. Hundreds of millions of people have moved from villages into cities. And it's not just about making clothes, toys, or cheap furniture anymore. China is producing advanced technologies, semiconductors, electric vehicles, solar panels, and building the kind of infrastructure that defines a modern economy: highways, ports, fiber optic networks, and high-speed rail.
Both sides met in Stockholm, China and the US. The goal was clear: avoid tariffs, end the impasse, and find common ground.
Like any fast-growing economy, this kind of transformation comes with a massive appetite for energy, especially oil. For years, China's demand for crude oil climbed steeply. As the country built new cities, factories, and transport networks, oil became essential, not just for fuel, but for producing plastics, chemicals, and asphalt. It powered trucks, construction machinery, and the cars that filled the roads of newly built cities.
Pressuring will not achieve anything. China will firmly defend its sovereignty, security, and development interests.
But here's the part that's caught the attention of economists and energy experts around the world. After decades of increasing oil imports, China's crude oil consumption has started to level off. In some years, it's even declined slightly. And that shift is surprising. You wouldn't expect a country still growing at scale, with an expanding middle class and ambitious development goals, to ease up on one of the most fundamental energy sources of the modern world. It's almost like a magic trick: rapid growth, yet stable oil demand. So the question is, how did China pull this off? To understand the answer, you have to look beyond the numbers and examine China's strategic thinking. It starts with the idea of vulnerability. While China is rich in coal and has built up nuclear and hydro capacity, it doesn't have large domestic reserves of easy-to-extract oil. That means it relies heavily on imports, around 11 million barrels a day as of recent years, which covers most of its national demand. That kind of dependence puts the country in a potentially risky position. Oil, as it turns out, doesn't just move across borders in pipelines. Much of the world's oil trade happens over sea routes, in giant tankers. And for China, roughly 90% of its oil imports arrive by ship. That creates a strategic bottleneck. These tankers pass through narrow sea lanes, some of which are controlled or monitored by foreign powers, particularly the United States. One of the most critical choke points is the Malacca Strait, a narrow passage between Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. This waterway links the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea, and beyond that, to the ports of mainland China. It's one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. Using it saves thousands of kilometers compared to alternative routes. But its geography also makes it easy to control or block, especially by a country with a powerful navy. And this is where the geopolitical tension comes in. The United States, with its global military reach and presence in the Asia-Pacific, maintains bases in the region and regularly patrols international waters, including the South China Sea. That presence has grown more visible as tensions over Taiwan and other issues have increased. Chinese officials have been aware of this vulnerability for years. As early as the early 2000s, military and economic planners in Beijing began openly referring to the Malacca dilemma, the fear that, in the event of conflict or serious political fallout, the U.S. could use its naval power to cut off China's oil supply. While a full blockade would be seen as an extreme step, arguably even an act of war, the fact that it's even possible highlights the fragility of China's energy security. This isn't just theoretical. Think about what a sudden disruption in oil supply could mean for China. The country relies on oil not only for transport, but also for many industrial processes. Even a short-term shortage could lead to fuel rationing, factory slowdowns, and serious economic damage. That's not something any major power can afford to risk, especially one with long-term ambitions of economic and technological leadership. President Xi Jinping has spoken publicly about this challenge. He's framed energy security as a matter of national security. From his perspective, it's essential that China reduces its exposure to external threats, particularly when it comes to something as fundamental as energy. So what's the strategy? It doesn't start with trying to eliminate oil overnight. Instead, it's about gradually reducing dependence where possible, while simultaneously securing supply chains and diversifying import sources. Over time, this creates a buffer, a kind of energy insurance policy. Part of that strategy involves rethinking how oil is used in the economy. Rather than pouring more crude into the same infrastructure, China has begun shifting the foundations of its energy model. And while we'll get into those details in the next section, especially around renewables and electric vehicles, it's important to understand that this shift wasn't random. It was a response to a clearly defined strategic risk. Now, none of this means China has become independent of oil. Far from it. The country still imports more crude than any other nation on Earth. But the urgency to rethink its energy path is very real. If anything, the slowdown in oil imports is the result of deliberate long-term planning, not a sudden drop in economic activity. It's worth noting that China isn't alone in facing these kinds of pressures. Many nations depend on foreign oil to keep their economies running. But China's scale, geography, and geopolitical positioning make its situation especially complex. Unlike European countries, which can rely on overland pipelines or regional partnerships, China's maritime supply routes are longer, more exposed, and potentially more contested. That's also why China has invested heavily in other solutions, like overland pipelines from Central Asia, rail and road links through its Belt and Road Initiative, and even new ports and refineries closer to oil-producing nations. All of this is meant to spread the risk, reduce choke points, and ensure that if one route is compromised, others can pick up the slack. There's another layer to this. As global attention focuses more on climate change and the shift toward clean energy, countries are rethinking what the energy mix of the future should look like. For China, reducing oil dependence doesn't just improve national security. It also aligns with longer-term environmental and economic goals. Cleaner air, domestic industry growth, and new global leadership in energy tech all become part of the same strategy. What looks like a sudden slowdown in oil imports is really part of a larger plan. China saw a strategic risk. It acted on that risk. And now we're seeing the early results. The roads are still full of cars. The factories are still running. But the country is becoming more selective, more strategic, and more self-reliant when it comes to oil. China's path toward energy security didn't just begin with identifying vulnerabilities. It also involved making large-scale structural changes to its energy system, starting with how the country uses oil. While crude oil can be refined into many things, plastics, chemicals, rubber, lubricants, one of its primary uses in China is still transportation fuel. For years, as Chinese cities expanded and personal incomes grew, so did the number of vehicles on the road. But what's unique about China's situation is that it entered this phase of motorization relatively late compared to the West. That timing presented a window of opportunity. At present, China has the largest total number of vehicles in the world. But when you break it down per capita, the picture looks very different. Roughly 450 million vehicles for a population of 1.4 billion means that most people in China still don't own a car. That matters because it gave the government and industry a chance to reshape the direction of the market before car ownership reached the levels seen in the US or Europe. While other countries have to retrofit existing systems or transition away from a deeply embedded petrol infrastructure, China was able to build its future transport system almost from scratch. Rather than relying purely on combustion engines, China began accelerating its investment into electric vehicles. This wasn't just about climate policy or consumer trends. It was a national strategic choice. If China could dominate the electric vehicle sector early, it could reduce its dependence on imported oil, strengthen its domestic manufacturing base, and even become a leading exporter in a rapidly growing global market. And this wasn't just about making electric cars available. The Chinese government understood early on that EVs would only be successful if the entire supporting system was built around them: charging stations, battery production, mineral supply chains, and of course the electricity grid itself. All of that had to be planned and built in parallel. That's where China's investment into renewable energy comes in. Building millions of electric vehicles wouldn't make much sense if the electricity used to charge them still came from coal or imported oil. So China made an effort to pivot toward cleaner, more domestically controlled energy sources: hydropower, nuclear, wind, and solar. Over time, the share of coal and oil in China's electricity mix started to shrink. A look at China's energy consumption over the last few decades makes this shift visible. In the 1960s and 70s, the country relied almost entirely on coal for its electricity. Oil began to play a larger role during the reform era as industrialization picked up speed. But in the last 15 years or so, renewable energy sources have rapidly gained ground. China now produces more solar and wind power than any other country on Earth. It's also one of the largest builders of nuclear plants and hydroelectric dams. This growth in renewables didn't happen by accident. It was the result of deliberate policy choices, long-term planning, and sustained investment. One of the reasons China was able to move so quickly is its control over critical parts of the renewable energy supply chain. Take wind power, for example. Many modern wind turbines use high-performance magnets made from rare earth elements. China controls around 60 to 70% of the world's supply of these elements. And when it comes to processing them, China's share jumps to nearly 90%. That control gave China a huge advantage. It meant the country wasn't just dependent on importing components for renewable infrastructure. It could mine, refine, manufacture, and install at scale without the risk of foreign supply disruptions. The same approach was taken with solar panels. Over the last decade, China has become the global leader in the production of photovoltaic cells, responsible for the majority of the world's supply. All of this fed into the electric vehicle strategy. With a growing base of clean domestic power and access to minerals and manufacturing, the EV industry was ready to take off. But China didn't stop at enabling conditions. It also directly supported the growth of electric cars through public subsidies, tax breaks, and regulatory support. For over a decade, the Chinese government provided generous financial incentives for both EV manufacturers and buyers. Consumers could get thousands of dollars in subsidies for buying an electric car, often combined with tax exemptions and special license plate access in crowded cities. At the same time, manufacturers were offered support for research and development, factory expansion, and export logistics. This dual approach meant the market could develop quickly and at scale. Companies like BYD, NIO, and XPeng emerged as domestic leaders, with BYD in particular rising to become a global giant. Recently, BYD overtook Tesla as the top-selling electric vehicle brand worldwide. Their cars are not only popular inside China, but increasingly found on roads across Europe, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. A model like the BYD Seagull, priced under $10,000, has drawn international attention for how affordable a quality EV can be when made at scale with government backing. By 2024, China accounted for 7 out of every 10 electric vehicles sold globally. That's a dramatic leap from just a decade earlier. In 2015, EV sales in China were just over 300,000 units. Today, that number is over 12 million annually. And it's not just about vehicles. The supporting ecosystem has grown just as fast. There are now around 14 million charging points across China, compared to only about 250,000 in the United States. That level of coverage makes it much easier for consumers to choose electric over petrol-powered cars. None of this came cheaply. According to estimates by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, China has spent well over $200 billion on the electric vehicle industry since the late 2000s. That includes everything from direct subsidies to infrastructure build-out and long-term R&D. But this wasn't just a cost. It was an investment in the country's future economic and energy independence. The success of the EV and renewable sectors feeds into a broader cycle. As domestic production of batteries, vehicles, and clean power increases, China becomes less dependent on foreign oil. That reduced demand, in turn, stabilizes oil imports and gives China more room to maneuver in its energy diplomacy. And because the manufacturing base is local, the economic benefits stay within the country, creating jobs, exports, and new technologies. So while the world often focuses on China's headline oil numbers, what's really happening is a carefully sequenced transition. The country first identified energy as a strategic vulnerability. Then it built out the supply chains and infrastructure to support clean alternatives. Finally, it pushed hard on adoption, both through consumer behavior and industrial policy. This isn't to say China has solved all its energy problems. Far from it. The country still uses a lot of coal, still imports millions of barrels of oil per day, and still faces serious environmental challenges. But the shift is real. The plateau in oil imports is not a coincidence or a fluke. It's the result of targeted efforts to reshape the foundations of China's economy. As global demand for electric vehicles continues to rise, China stands to benefit not only from internal market growth, but also from exports. The same is true for solar panels, batteries, and wind turbines. These industries are now key parts of China's long-term strategy, not just to power its own economy, but to shape the global energy landscape as well. As China expands its electric vehicle industry and renewable energy production, it has also taken a series of steps aimed at reshaping the global oil trade and securing its energy supply in more ways than one. One of the more subtle but significant developments has been how China has worked to bypass some of the traditional structures that have long defined global oil markets, especially those influenced by Western powers like the United States. Despite numerous sanctions imposed by the US and its allies on certain oil-exporting countries, such as Russia, Venezuela, and Iran, China has continued to import oil from these nations, often in significant volumes. In fact, estimates suggest that more than 20% of China's crude oil imports in recent years have come from countries under various sanctions. This is a notable strategic move, reflecting China's willingness to engage with these producers and build alternative supply chains, regardless of Western opposition. One of the ways China manages to facilitate this trade is through independent refineries commonly known as teapots. These are smaller, privately owned refineries that operate with less scrutiny and regulatory oversight than state-owned giants. Their nimbleness allows them to import cheaper, often sanctioned oil, refine it, and then export the products to other parts of Asia. This system has proven quite lucrative for those involved and has helped China diversify its sources of oil, weakening the effectiveness of sanctions aimed at curbing the supply to certain countries. This parallel oil trade is part of a broader strategy to challenge the dominant role that the United States has held over global energy markets for decades. The US not only controls a large share of oil production, but also holds the world's largest strategic petroleum reserve. This reserve, consisting of hundreds of millions of barrels of crude oil, is designed to stabilize markets and provide a buffer against supply disruptions. It also gives the US considerable leverage in geopolitical matters, as the ability to release or withhold oil supplies can influence global prices and energy security. China, recognizing the strategic importance of such reserves, has begun building its own stockpiles. When crude oil prices are low, Chinese state and private buyers increase imports, filling enormous storage tanks scattered throughout the country. These reserves serve multiple purposes. They act as a buffer against sudden price spikes. They provide protection against supply disruptions, and they enhance China's ability to negotiate with suppliers on more equal footing. The country's growing inventories indicate a clear understanding that energy security goes beyond just the volume of oil imported daily. It's about managing risk through reserves and alternative sources. China is also investing heavily in increasing its own domestic oil and natural gas production. Although the country has long been a major importer of crude oil, recent years have seen a strategic push to boost exploration and production inside its borders. This is not an easy task. Much of China's domestic oil is trapped in geologically challenging environments, deep underground or under the sea, making extraction complex and costly. Nonetheless, China's national oil companies have committed billions of dollars to ramp up their exploration efforts. For example, China National Petroleum Corporation, CNPC, one of the country's largest state-owned enterprises, spent roughly $38 billion on new infrastructure and exploration projects last year alone, more than what ExxonMobil and Chevron combined invested in similar efforts. The drilling sites often reach depths greater than the height of Mount Everest, underscoring the technical challenges involved. This expansion in domestic production has led to a slow but steady increase in the volume of oil China extracts internally. While these gains don't come close to meeting the total demand, they help reduce the net volume of imports required. This incremental shift forms part of China's larger energy strategy: secure as much domestic supply as possible while simultaneously developing renewable energy and electric vehicles to reduce long-term dependence on oil imports. What makes China's position especially interesting in 2025 is that its oil import growth has not only slowed, but is expected by some analysts to peak within a few years. In contrast to previous decades, when China's oil demand surged relentlessly, the forecast now anticipates a plateau or even a decline in consumption. This is a major turning point, reflecting the success of policies aimed at energy diversification and electrification. The implications of this shift extend beyond China's borders. As the world's second-largest economy and top oil importer, any change in China's oil demand sends ripples through global energy markets. Reduced Chinese demand could lead to lower global oil prices or force oil-exporting countries to find new customers. Conversely, China's increasing reliance on renewables and electric vehicles puts pressure on countries to develop and export critical minerals, batteries, and clean technologies. China's efforts to control strategic mineral supply chains are another crucial piece of the puzzle. Beyond rare earth elements used in wind turbines and electric motors, China dominates the refining and processing of lithium, cobalt, and other materials essential to battery production. This dominance gives China a significant edge in the global clean energy race and ensures that its renewable energy and EV ambitions are backed by stable supplies of key inputs. All of this forms a complex, interconnected strategy designed to insulate China from external pressures, whether military, economic, or geopolitical. The vulnerability China identified in its oil supply chain, particularly the risk of naval blockades in strategic waterways such as the Malacca Strait, has pushed the country to build multiple layers of energy security. This layered approach includes boosting domestic production, diversifying import sources, investing in strategic reserves, and transitioning away from fossil fuels through renewable energy and electric vehicles. It's a multifaceted effort that balances immediate needs with long-term goals. The strategic risks are real. The Malacca Strait, a narrow and vital maritime choke point connecting Middle Eastern oil exporters to East Asian consumers, is heavily patrolled by the U.S. Navy and its allies. A blockade or disruption there would severely impact China's oil imports, potentially crippling its economy. China has openly discussed this risk for over 2 decades, often referring to it as the Malacca Dilemma. China's response has been to build alternative pipelines and shipping routes, invest in the security of overseas energy assets, and diversify supply chains. The country's Belt and Road Initiative includes investments in pipelines, ports, and infrastructure across Central Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, aimed at ensuring steady energy access. At the same time, China has accelerated the electrification of its economy, reducing oil's share in energy consumption and transportation. By 2025, these efforts have resulted in a far more balanced and resilient energy system, one that relies less on any single source or route. Yet China still faces challenges ahead. While electric vehicles and renewables are growing fast, coal remains a significant part of the energy mix, and oil will continue to play a role for years to come. The country must manage a careful transition that supports economic growth, energy security, and environmental goals simultaneously. Internationally, China's evolving energy policies are reshaping global dynamics. Its large-scale investments in renewables and electric vehicles have accelerated the global clean energy transition. At the same time, its role in circumventing sanctions and controlling mineral supplies introduces new geopolitical complexities. China's journey from a rapidly industrializing nation reliant on imported oil to a renewable energy superpower with a strategic approach to energy independence is one of the defining stories of the early 21st century. The country's actions are deliberate, well-planned, and multifaceted, aimed at securing its energy future in an increasingly uncertain world.